Good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to talk about the lessons we learned from the passage and implementation of the Telecom Act of 1996. My name is Dina Shetler. I'm Chief of Staff for Commissioner Anna Gomez, and I will be your MC for today's program. I will go over important housekeeping rules before we get to our speakers and panels. This afternoon, we will hear from a great cast of telecommunications and technology policy experts that lived through the creation and implementation of the historic 96 Act. We will begin with opening remarks from Chairman Brendan Carr, followed by remarks from Commissioner Anna Gomez. We will then go on to our panels. The first panel will explore the legislative process that led to passage of the Act. The second panel will discuss the implementation of the Act. And the third panel will consider lessons from the 96 Act that we can apply to today's communications challenges. The program will continue without interruption or breaks, apart from the few minutes that it will take to transition from one panel to the next. After each panel conversation, there will be a few minutes for Q&A. Attendees can submit questions by using the Q&A function on Teams. You can find this function at the top or bottom of your screen, depicted by a logo that says Q&A. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we will only be able to select a few questions. Now, without further delay, let's proceed with the program. And first, I am pleased to welcome the Chair of the FCC to offer opening remarks for this event. Please welcome Chairman Brendan Carr.
Thank you so much, Dina, for that introduction, and thank you to Commissioner Gomez, both for putting together this fabulous event, for coming up with the idea to make sure that we honor this important anniversary here at the FCC, and of course for the opportunity to open up with a couple words of remarks. Commissioner Gomez, she won't me saying this publicly, but I consider at least her a good friend, and I really enjoy working with her, and everything she brings to the table here at the FCC, everything we do, in my opinion, is improved greatly by having her here and her ideas, everything she brings to the table. I also really look forward to the panels to come. A lot of good friends are on the panel, including Tom Wheeler. Some associates like Rob McDowell are also on the panel, I see. But I look forward to everything that folks have to offer. For my own part, I look back at the 1996 Act. I was a junior in high school. I had a complete and full head of hair, and I was enjoying my very first pager and learning how to use that. I think I may have gotten a cell phone around that same time as well. And to think about how many things have changed since then, really in part to a lot of the panelists that are going to be speaking here, the entire, new commercial version of the internet unleashed thanks to the groundwork and the legwork that you all did back then. To some extent, for me, a little bit late to the party being in high school back then, it sort of is like hearing about Woodstock, something that sounds like really cool and interesting, but something that I was not nearly around enough to actually get to experience. So I look forward to it. The one thing from my own perspective is just the idea of convergence. And to some extent, I think, you guys can correct me, one of the promises of the 96 Act was this idea of breaking down silos, of introducing new competitors in new markets. And it was bumpy, and maybe it was slower than what people wanted. It was a lot of pinging back and forth in courts. But more than ever before, we are actually seeing that convergence now. You've got cable companies that are taking very large shares of the mobile wireless segment. You've got mobile wireless players that are taking big shares of the in-home broadband market. You've got satellite players competing in all different sectors. We're really sort of, I think, truly in this more frothy, converged environment, thanks to the work that happened in the 96 Act. Of course, there's no raising of the mission accomplished flag or banner at this point. There's a lot to do. And I really look forward to the opportunity to see your all's sort of lessons learned from 96 and where past is prologue in terms of how we can take the lessons of that time and apply it to the challenges we face now. But with that, I know you guys aren't here to hear or listen to me per se, and so happy to sort of move on to the rest of the day, but I look forward to seeing what comes of these panels and discussions.
Thank you, Chairman Carr, for your insightful remarks as we begin an afternoon of thoughtful conversations. I would now like to welcome Commissioner Anna Gomez to provide introductory remarks.
Thank you, Dina. Good afternoon, And thank you everyone for joining us today for an afternoon of insightful, educational, and fun conversations. And thank you to the chairman for kicking us off. I really appreciated your remarks. And I have a few years on you, but still enjoyed a lot of the developments that we got from the 1996 Act. I also have really enjoyed working with you, and your support for the FCC has been excellent. So the 96 Telecom Act represented an acknowledgement of the vast technological advancements that had taken place since 1934 and had transformed society. Congressional passage of the Act and the subsequent FCC implementation was the last major effort by the federal government to construct a new regulatory framework for the technology, media, and telecom sectors to support competition for the benefit of consumers. At the time of its passage, telephone service was prevalent, but divided into local and long-distance service with limited competition in the local sector, and telephone providers were prohibited from providing video services. Cable was an established technology and reached millions of households, but consumer options were limited. Therefore, one of the goals of the 96 Act was to open local telephone and cable services to competition. The Act also acknowledged that the internet is an emerging technology and it had the potential to profoundly transform the way we communicate in the future. Dial-up, believe it or not, was avant-garde, state-of-the-art connectivity at that time. A new era of wireless communications was also beginning to take shape. The FCC received spectrum auction authority 3 years before the Act passed. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau was only a year old, and the 5th spectrum auction was underway and ultimately garnered a record-breaking $10 billion in winning bids. The Act also contributed significantly to improving the lives of people with disabilities. It required rules on closed captions on television, allowed the FCC to study audio description, and established requirements for telecommunications service providers and equipment manufacturers to ensure at the design and development stage that services and equipment are accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. These provisions led to innovations in texting, video, and hands-free communications that today benefit all consumers. And let's not forget the critical impact of the Act on codifying and expanding universal service. Universal service had long existed in the form of implicit subsidies, but the Act made the support explicit. The Act created the Universal Service Fund, which has been the cornerstone of activity for rural providers serving in high-cost areas, for schools and libraries and healthcare facilities being able to obtain critical connectivity, and for households that would otherwise have remained on the wrong side of the digital divide without the Lifeline program. 30 years later, the innovation that the Act ushered has surpassed what we imagined possible, and technological progress has once again reshaped communications. Cell phones are nearly ubiquitous globally. The internet has gone from a screeching, slow-moving innovation to a seamless lightning speed necessity in daily life. By now, the FCC has held over 100 spectrum auctions. There are myriad wireless devices embedded in our daily lives, appliances, laptops, security cameras, headphones, fitness trackers, augmented reality glasses, and even mugs to keep our coffee at the perfect temperature. And we now see accessibility as a foundational principle. For example, we enjoy automatic captioning in video platforms, and ASL interpreters are commonly present in video recordings, as they are with this one. The progress is simply astonishing. So I was a legal advisor in the Common Carrier Bureau, now known as the Wireline Competition Bureau, when Congress passed the 96 Act, and we were responsible for implementing a lot of it. It was an incredibly busy time. The entire FCC worked extraordinarily hard to implement Congress's directives, and I felt and feel extremely lucky to have been on the ground floor at a pivotal time for communications history. The Act gave us a pro-competitive framework that led to a lot of the evolution of technology that we have today. But of course, implementing the Act and supporting competition didn't come without challenges. Deadlines were short, staff needed to be sourced, and new concepts were in trial mode. We tried, we failed, we succeeded, we tried again, and we learned a lot. That is why I am delighted that we are gathered today to reminisce and talk about the lessons that we can discern from the creation and implementation of the historic Telecommunications Act of 1996. We've brought together a group of brilliant communications and technology policy experts that lived through the creation and implementation of the 96 Act. We'll discuss the legislative process, the implementation, and lessons learned from 30 years ago that can be used to drive innovation and competition for the benefit of consumers today. So I hope you enjoy these conversations and find them inspiring. Thank you.
I'm not sure where my video went, but here we go. Thank you, Commissioner Gomez, for providing this context and setting the stage for our panels this afternoon. We now turn to the first panel of the afternoon, the legislative process that led to the act. To introduce the panel is our first moderator, John Nakahara. John is the chair of HWG LLP and widely recognized as a leading telecommunications attorney. John worked in Congress for Senator Joe Lieberman in the years leading up to the act. He moved to the commission in 1995 and served in leadership positions for 2 FCC chairs during the critical early years of implementation. John served as senior legal advisor to Chairman Hunt and as chief of staff to Chairman Kennard. Sorry. Just a reminder to you, those watching, to submit questions by using the Q&A button at the top or bottom of your screen. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Dina. So we have a great panel here today to talk about the legislation, people that were actually involved in all the critical stages of it. John Windhausen, who had worked at the FCC for 2.5 years, was senior counsel at the Senate Commerce Committee on the Democratic side, working for Chairman Fritz Hollings and Subcommittee Chairman Daniel Inouye. During the time leading up to and with the passage of the 1996 Act. After that, he went on to a number of positions, but later founded and led the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition from 2009 to just last year. And he's now consulting. Gina Keeney was John's counterpart on the Republican side. And from 1985 to 1994, she was the Republican chief counsel for communications on the Senate Commerce Committee, and John was involved in drafting on the Senate side the precursors to what became the 96 Act. Gina went on to the FCC towards the end of 1994 to be the first chief of the Wireless Bureau. But Gina is sort of the one person who could be on both panels, on 1 and 2 today, because after the 1996 Act, she became chief of the Common Carrier Bureau and led the implementation of the 96 Act through its early critical stages. She then went on after that to head the FCC's International Bureau. So Gina really did quite the tour at the FCC in the leadership, and then went on to practice law until last year. Last but certainly not least of our panel is Katie King. So Katie succeeded Gina on the Republican side of the Senate Commerce Committee after the Senate flipped from Democratic control to Republican control in the start of 95. She had been a legislative assistant to Senator Pressler in 1993-94, and then became the communications counsel on the majority side of the Senate Commerce Committee, and saw the act through final passage. Katie had a major role in the high cost issues that we'll be talking about, and after she was did that, she went on to the FCC, where she continued to work on high cost issues until she just retired last year. So we have the people here who were actually there, at least on the Senate side. Unfortunately, we don't have any House side people here today. But if you want to read at least one person's account of the 1990 Act, there's a good I think it's Substack set of articles by Colin Crowell telling the House Democratic, at least, perspective on the 1996 Act, which is not always the same as the Senate perspective. So with that, let's dive into the panel. And I guess I'd like to start with John and Gina a little bit, because the 96 Act was signed in February of 1996, but the work started earlier. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about when it started and what groundwork had to be laid, and kind of what led to the key progress, and what were the key milestones, at least through the end of 94.
Do you want to start, John?
Okay, I'll start and then turn it to you. I'll lay a little bit of the foundation in the background. So, of course, the 1934 Act was really driven by two industries. It was an effort to regulate the broadcasters and an effort to regulate AT&T. And both of those industries actually welcomed that regulation, because they, at least at AT&T's part, they used the regulation as a way to keep out competitors. And so they were able to rationalize their monopoly status. Well, that all changed leading into the 1996 Act. It started with the wheels were in motion with the MFJ, the court decision that broke up AT&T, as the beginnings of competition came into the long distance market. And then we began to see benefits from long distance industry competition. And we collectively decided, we really ought to have a more competitive environment for all of these industries. And that's what really led to the idea behind the Telecom Act. Gina and I worked very closely together on the Cable Act in 92 and the Spectrum Auction Act in 93. So we had a good working bipartisan relationship right from the beginning. And we put that bill together for Senator Hollings, Danforth, and Inouye in 1993, S 1822, that passed the Senate Commerce Committee by a vote of 18-2. And that included the E-rate provision, the Snow-Rockefeller Amendment, which was maybe the one partisan blip where that was adopted by a 10-8 vote in the Senate Commerce Committee. But then it became more bipartisan as the process rolled along. And, we made a lot of progress in 1993, 94. Senator Dole then raised some objections, so we weren't able to get it done in that Congress. And then when the elections took place, Republicans took over control of both the House and the Senate. And the big question was, well, what's going to happen with Telecom Act reform? Well, the reality is we picked up right where we had left off from the year before, and worked closely with Katie King and Senator Pressler to craft a new version, a revised version, but still building off of the work that we had done in the 2 years before that, ultimately leading to the signing of the bill on February 8th of 1996. So, Gina, I'll toss it to you to see if I got that right.
Okay, of course you did. I guess I would add to that, and maybe this is a lesson learned from the process and a little bit of hope, that despite having very different perspectives and very different personalities, the members and the staff all wanted to do something. And I think they had developed over, even in late 80s, kind of both the muscle and momentum for doing things. We had passed authorization bills that hadn't been passed for years for FCC, NTIA, Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Some of you may remember. And smaller bills, too, that may be of historical interest, but we adjusted the terms of the FCC commissioners. So they had developed the ability and kind of the momentum to pick up the lighter weights, and then we're ready to pick up the heavier weights for the 93 Act, which was just Danforth and Inouye, and a very slim bill. Didn't get very far, but helped set up sort of the framework for the 94 Act. And one of the themes of the 94 Act was, 1934 to 1994, and we were sure we were going to have that 60-year anniversary and revision. It didn't quite turn out that way, but the work was being done early on. and mostly because there was a will to work together.
Maybe toss it to Katie to pick up from the change in control in 95 and kind of what were the drivers from your perspective, or what was the key things that happened in your perspective from 95 to 96?
Well, I think it was actually a pretty smooth transition as far as, what the work that had gone before, and we were just building on it. Senator Pressler was, very focused on getting legislation passed. I think he hand carried a draft bill to all the members of the committee and, worked, really well with, my picture just disappeared. How bizarre. Anyway,
We can see
so,
you, Katie.
well, I can't see anyone. Okay, you're all back. Anyway, I mean, I think we all worked, really well together on the Senate side. I
Yeah,
think I think, our main adversaries were the House side on universal service issues, but on the Senate side, we got along fine. And John, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in to add to that, Katie. Do you remember that in January of 1995, right after you had assumed the majority, you and the other Republicans put together your own draft bill. And then we on the Democratic side put together our draft bill 2 weeks later in February. And then we had a mini conference of our own just among the senators, the Senate Republicans and Democrats. We got together and worked out a joint bill that ended up becoming S652 and passing through the Senate. So yes, once we had that sort of dueling bills at the start, then we collaborated and worked together, and we were all bought in to continue that collaborative work and get the bill through.
Right.
I mean, in some ways, what you're saying is remarkable, given that the time going on at the same time was the Gingrich revolution in the House, right? With a complete upheaval and overturning of all sorts of things in the House. Much more continuity, it sounds like, in the Senate.
Yeah,
So what?
it was.
Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just agreeing with you.
Yeah.
And I'll just add to that, John, that on the Senate passage, the joint bill that Katie and I worked on, S652, it passed the Senate by a vote of 81 to 18. So it was really quite an overwhelming support of votes for the bill.
And I would add to that too, some of it has to do with the makeup of the Commerce Committee jurisdiction, because the members, might have one particular interest on telecom, but a very different interest in fisheries or airport slots. And you had to be willing to put it bluntly, you can't be a jerk, because you're not going to get what you want on all these other issues. So you had to kind of find a way to find agreement, even if you had different interests on telecom.
So it sounds like, and one question I had was like, so how did members' relationships play into the development and passage? And Gina, I think you were just sort of talking a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think there was a feeling, I know my boss, Senator Danforth, would say, I don't understand why people want to get elected if they don't want to do anything. And there was, this constant push with staff. Don't be sitting around here, get some bills passed.
Maybe kind of can you help people understand sort of what the key drivers were on the legislation? I mean, usually there's like an engine and there's lots of cars that get added to the train along the way, but sort of what were the key drivers here that really pushed the legislation along?
Well, I'll take a stab at starting that off, but I think the first driver was the desire by the Bell operating companies to be released from the restrictions that came out of the MFJ. I mean, the breakup of AT&T separated the long distance industry from the 7 local Bell operating companies, but the Bell companies were still, in the court's view, the Bell companies were still considered monopolies over local phone service, so they were barred from providing long distance service, information services, or manufacturing. And the theory was by the court that because they had a monopoly over local, they could use that monopoly to extend and have market power in these other adjacent markets. So the Bell companies were very actively engaged in trying to overturn those restrictions. And I think this is one of those bipartisan issues where both Democrats and Republicans were really dedicated to the idea that a single federal court judge should not be setting telecom policy, that really should be an act of Congress. So that was probably the first big driver of the Telecom Act by the Bell companies. But then there was also a desire to promote competition. And, you know, the cable industry could not provide telephone service. The telephone companies could not provide cable service, which is hard to think of that was the universe that we were in back then. But both of those industries also supported being free to enter each other's markets. And then you had the universal service provisions, which I think both Gina and Katie mentioned, which were bedrock foundational principles. If you're going to open the market to competition, well, you needed to make sure that there was a subsidy mechanism in place to continue to reach these rural and high cost areas, and then the schools and libraries and healthcare providers as well. So I actually put a blog together, an article that the Benton Institute was gracious to publish, and I identified the 5 different themes of the Telecom Act. So the first ones I already mentioned: first, opening the markets to competition; second, phasing in deregulation, not immediate deregulation, but phasing it in; third, universal service; fourth, there were consumer safeguards; and then fifth was the encouragement of online services. So I think those 5 different components were really driving and created momentum. Once folks saw the bill moving, then others wanted to get on that train as well.
Were there industry groups that wanted to block the legislation? Or would have had incentives to block the legislation?
I think every industry had something they wanted. So I think I don't know that there was anyone trying to block it, but correct me if I'm wrong, Gina.
No, I agree with that. And I think, you know, there's a moving train, and a majority of the Commerce Committee is for it or has co-sponsored it. Stopping it would be pretty hard, so you might as well just hop on the train, I think was what was going on. And it was more an argument about the timing and the terms. You know, the Bell companies wanted freedoms. What were the preconditions to getting those?
Yeah, just
Do you
looking
think that
at
it was? No, go ahead, John. Sorry.
Oh, so sorry. Just looking at the final vote on the conference report, it was pretty overwhelming. I mean, the Senate voted in favor of the final language by a vote of 91-5. And the House was similar, 414-16 against. So that gives you an indication that there was a huge amount of support. You know, we must have done something right in the conference report to work out the issues that as the longer things went along in a bipartisan way, the more votes we were able to get to support the bill.
Just one other question on that line. It seems like, you know, looking back in retrospect, if it were, you know, AT&T or MCI, they ended up losing strategically a lot of position as a result of the 96 Act. Do you have any speculation as to why they didn't just move to block, since the Bells weren't in needed legislation to get into long distance?
I think John referred to this, but there was a sense that Congress needed to act. You can't have what the judge had blessed as the law of the land. And there was also kind of a, I don't know if it was misguided or correctly guided, a sense of competitiveness. The US was being held back by holding back some of our largest companies in the telecommunications industry. And I don't think AT&T or Sprint or others at the time really had a great answer to that. You know, why would you keep, turns out they may not have been interested, but why would you keep the Bell companies out of manufacturing? How does that help the country?
Yeah, I remember us talking about everybody wanting to get into everybody else's business, and that was sort of a goal, to open all markets to competition.
So what did it take kind of I mean, most legislation is a coalition, right? So what did it take to pull the coalition together here?
Well, I think it started small, as John and Katie have talked about, which is, you know, the Bell companies really pushing, and then others saying, well, you know, the cable companies weren't all that happy with the cable legislation and thought maybe they should get something more out of this one. Much later in the process, the broadcasters said, oh, hey, we've got stuff we want too. So it kept building because there was momentum to do something.
Yeah, I think everybody wanted something, you know, every part of the industry wanted something. And so that was enough momentum to.
Well, that's true. I think I just add, but they also had to give something up in return for getting something. So the Bells, just to take that example, right?
Good point.
We allowed them into long distance manufacturing and information services, which they really wanted, but that also meant they had to give up their local monopoly. And that was the critical importance of the unbundling provisions that required the local phone companies and the Bell companies to open up their networks for interconnection and use by potential competitors, and created the CLEC, the competitive local exchange carriers. So the Bells, you know, we're getting things and losing things. Same with the cable companies who were getting some rate deregulation that benefited them. They were getting the right to get into the local market, but then they had to give up some other things, like on pole attachments. So it was always a game of trying to match that. Nobody got everything that they wanted, but it also had to fit within the structure of the purpose of the Telecom Act to reduce barriers to entry and allow more parties to enter each other's markets.
Right.
So out of curiosity, now we look at the telecom markets, and wireless is this huge player. But if we think back to 94, 95, I mean, we barely had the spectrum auction, the broadband spectrum auctions, I think, Gina, that authorized. I guess maybe, no, I guess you were still in there. And you ran, right? You ran. And then, so, and if I remember right, the first digital cell phones came out in like 95 or something like that, right? So it's like really early. Well, where was wireless in this? Were people thinking about wireless at all in this picture?
It's funny, I ran across a memo to my boss talking about the interests of another senator. I won't get into too much detail, but the cell phone companies were not entirely happy with the 92 Act, and they wanted certain protections. And they also didn't want to have to contribute to any universal service. So they were hoping to get more freedoms and not have to contribute. And that is obviously not what happened. But they were players in that sense, that they had things they wanted, but they didn't get very far with what they were asking for.
John, Katie, any thoughts to add on sort of how you were thinking about wireless at the time, if you can put your head back 30 years?
Well, I think we had addressed some of the wireless issues a couple of years earlier in the Spectrum Auction Act, which also allocated, required the Department of Defense to give up some of their spectrum. I think it was 200 megahertz at the time that we wanted to make available for PCS, personal communication services. So that was an initial foray into trying to free up more spectrum, which the wireless companies had already obtained a couple of years before. So I think they also liked the pole attachments provision that would make it a little easier for them to locate their antennas. But I don't recall other than that where the wireless industry had as much at stake in the 96 Act.
So let's turn to one of the other things that was you mentioned earlier as a key part of the 96 Act, which was universal service. And sort of what were the dynamics around that in the Senate and in between the Senate and the House? I mean, I'll share my perspective when I was doing the implementation at the FCC is that the Senate had its view of universal service and the House had its view of universal service, and they weren't really the same.
Fair.
So I guess maybe talk a little bit about the universal service provisions and the farm team, and how did that all come together, and what role did that play in the actual act itself?
Well, I'll start with a couple observations. That universal service was not even written into the 1934 Act, not in so many words. And when there were monopolies, and monopolies were presumed, there was no need to worry quite as much about universal service. But on the other hand, with competition, and if others were going to be allowed into the local telephone, what was considered the local telephone market at the time, you had to come up with some way to address, you can call it was called all different kinds of things: cream skimming, cherry picking, carrier of last resort, left holding the bag. And so that was a driver. How are you going to address universal service in the face of competition? But Katie and John were very involved in the details of all that.
Well,
Katie?
I mean, well, you have all of these big square states that have a lot of rural areas that, senators were concerned that they would be left behind with, all the new technologies and things. So, our biggest opponents on universal service were with the House. I remember fighting with our House colleagues in conference because they really didn't like the universal service provisions. And, and that's because a lot of House members didn't represent rural areas.
Well, John, you mentioned the farm team, and just to clarify, so that was sort of a subgroup of the Senate Commerce Committee members. I remember Senator Exon, the Democrat from Nebraska, and then Ted Stevens and Earl Comstock were driving a lot of the farm team work. So it was a bipartisan group subset. And Senator Hollings, my boss, also had a lot of rural telcos in South Carolina. So we were supportive of the farm team's efforts. But that was, again, a bipartisan effort to try to ensure that the Telecom Act didn't mean that the rural and high-cost areas were going to be left to their own devices. There need to be a more explicit mechanism to make sure that that funding would continue. So I remember working very closely with the rural telcos on those universal service provisions and the farm team to get that done. And then I think the House ended up in the conference, even though the House staff, and as Katie said, weren't all that comfortable with the universal service provisions. At the end of the day, they ceded to the Senate because they realized if there wasn't a universal service protections, there was not going to be a bill, that they had that much support in the Senate that it would die. So they needed to get along with the Senate, which they ended up doing.
I remember being in a meeting with the farm team staff and Senator Rockefeller, and he said at one point, "What am I doing on the farm team?" which cracked us up. But of course, the Snow Rockefeller provisions were an important part of the universal service provisions too. So.
Well, interestingly, I mean, John mentioned earlier, and the fact that I had not realized, which is that the Snow Rockefeller provisions, or at least their predecessors, had actually been in the 93, 94 legislation.
94.
94 legislation.
And we had even been meeting with House staff back then on, how, if they were to pass, if both houses were to pass a bill, how would the final bill end up? And there was very different take on E-rate and universal service, even back then in the House, and E-rate in particular, which surprised me a little bit. But I do remember doing a little behind the scenes lobbying of groups to try to move them.
And obviously, yeah, Ed Markey, obviously in the House, was a big champion of E-rate.
Yeah.
But I mean, it sort of seems like that was a big shift I mean, universal service up to that point had been mostly high cost and low income after the kind of access charge changes in the 1980s, right, with the introduction of Lifeline. But that was a real shift to institutional anchor, what we might now think of as, John maybe came up with the term of anchor tenants.
Anchor institutions. Right.
Yeah.
But yeah,
And so was that. No, go ahead, John.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to note that Senator McCain tried to strip the E-rate provisions and rural healthcare provisions on the Senate floor, and he offered an amendment to delete those provisions out of the universal service package, and his motion lost by a pretty overwhelming vote of something like 58 to 34. So again, a lot of Republicans as well as Democrats supported the E-rate program when it got to the floor.
So turning to get to another area that was sort of nascent at the time, and just trying to keep my eye on the clock here too. Broadband. John, I saw you spoke at Benton earlier this year, or a couple months ago, I guess, on one of the other 96 Act commemorations, and saw that you had sort of said, "Gee, you wished you had addressed the classification of broadband at the time." And I went back and looked, and I thought you were being a little hard on yourself, but given that cable modems really didn't start until 1996 commercially. But kind of the Act did talk about advanced telecommunication services. So where was kind of what we now think of as broadband in the consciousness of the Congress and in the contemplation of the bill?
Well, we really didn't know enough about the future. We were, I think, somewhat prescient in identifying advanced services as a key component, and then built into the universal service provisions some flexibility for advanced services to, like, we recognize the market would evolve. And so we didn't want universal service to be stuck at one baseline technology. So we needed to encourage advanced services and for the FCC to have the freedom to add services like broadband into the Universal Service Fund in the future. So in that sort of big picture way, I think we got it right. Where we got it wrong was really from a legal perspective, we didn't clarify the definition of broadband, whether it's going to be a telecom common carrier service or a information service. And I think, I came out of the FCC, where FCC had been struggling with this question through the computer inquiry line of decisions, computer 1, computer 2, then computer 3. And I sort of accepted, okay, well, let's use those FCC definitions to put those into legislation to identify the difference between common carriage and Title I information services. But the difficulty we had is that we were also trying to reform the MFJ language, which used this other, the FCC language was based on enhanced services. the MFJ talked about information services. So we were trying to wrestle with definitions to that would clarify, but we didn't really do a good enough job. And there's still, and if you look at the language of in the act, they really are overlapping. And yet they also say, the act also said you have to be one or the other. You can't be both. So we created this confusion that ended up playing over decades of litigation with over net neutrality. And that was a real failure on our part. We didn't clarify that. And maybe if we'd had another year or two to get that done, it would have been more clear what the boundaries are. But at that stage, we had the momentum, so we needed to get the bill done when we did.
Well, John, in your defense, sometimes in legislation, if things are clear, you can't get them passed either.
That's a fair point. Yeah, all parties sort of read the definitions the way they wanted to. Right.
Well, I remember being at the FCC after the act passed, and Earl Comstock absolutely pounding the table and insisting that the internet was a common carrier service, a telecom service.
And that was the legislative intent.
And that was, yes,
Was the
the
assertion.
absolutely crystal clear legislative intent, and according to Earl. So that was definitely an interesting period.
Or just to clarify, Earl was working for a Republican senator at the time, right, who was calling for that regulation.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, for people who don't know Earl Comstock was the counsel to Senator Stevens from Alaska. So, but he teamed up on that with later on, at least at the time, and maybe later on, with Senator Burns from Montana on the same issue. So. One other provision that has sort of continued to be in discussion is Section 230, which is sort of out there in Title V of the Act. And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how Section 230 came to be, what its main drivers were at the time. Remember, it was called the Communications Decency Act, at least at one point. So,
I remember, and I don't remember which industry group this was, but I remember being threatened by them that said, if we don't get Section 230, we're going to work to kill the bill, which, it was very important to them. So I don't know if I don't know if anyone else had similar conversations, but as I said, I don't remember who it was. So
I remember in the Senate, we had the Communications Decency Act, sponsored by Senator Exon, largely from Nebraska. And I believe Section 230 originated on the House side and was an effort by the online industry to say, look, if you want to encourage these advanced services, we need to have some protections. We shouldn't be liable for third parties posting material on our websites. And if we're, everybody's so in favor of these new information services, but a certain number of lawsuits could cut off the flow of investment into the online services community, and it could be could be the death of the industry right from even before it got started. Now, Section 230 has turned into much more controversial today, now that the online services, which was a good thing. I mean, we wanted to encourage these online services. That was what these advanced services were all about. So we were very sympathetic, even on the Senate side, to incorporating that House provision into the final bill. But now, of course, it's taken on a life of its own, and really, there's a good argument why we need to revisit that blanket Section 230 exception, because these services and AI pose some fundamental threats to our economy and to jobs and to decency. So there's a real need to take another look at the AI industry.
Gina, Katie, any thoughts further on?
No, other just to add maybe a humorous note, which is an early version of the Decency Act was broader. And I remember walking to the Senate floor with my boss, Senator Danforth, and raising constitutional issue. You know, was this unconstitutional? And he looked at me like, "Are you out of your mind?" And then it passed 96-4 or something. Like, don't bother me with the details on that.
And then some parts were declared unconstitutional, if I recall.
Well,
yeah. So you weren't wrong.
Yeah, but we weren't at the Supreme Court. We were in a political body.
Very interesting question that came in. Was sort of with everyone wanting to do something, you know, what kept us from collapsing of its own weight or becoming, you know, like the Christmas tree that you know just can't move at some point.
Well, I think there was just a real desire to get things done among the members, but the industry as well, and an inability to sort of stop the moving train unless you were going to mess around with the rural telecoms. They might have stopped it.
And I think there was really something for just about every industry in the bill. There was something everybody wanted, one way or the other. I mean, they didn't get everything they wanted, but there was, as I recall, there was just something.
Well, I would say that's all true, but I would also point out that there were several public interest provisions also included in the bill, like a privacy provision, disabilities access, the V-chip allowing consumers to screen out violent programming. We included a provision to bar redlining of service to low-income communities, and there was an anti-slamming provision to make sure long-distance companies didn't charge you excessively. Mm-hmm. So there were a number of, I know Ralph Nader criticized the act as corporate welfare, but it wasn't just the industries who were asking for this. We had a lot of public interest support and consumer support as well.
Right.
Maybe I was wondering if you all think about, you know, do you see a constellation of issues now that could drive further compromise? Or are we in such an adversarial environment that is not possible? I mean, you had some magic in 1993 to 96, right? So, I mean, are there ingredients for more magic?
Well, I hope there's a growing recognition that universal service is sort of becoming unsustainable. Not the concept of universal service, but the exact mechanism, and that needs to be revised. And, you know, if members as different as the members were back in the 93, 96 era can get together to find common interest, I want to hold out some hope that it can be done today. These aren't necessarily partisan issues. They're more geographic issues. And it seems to me there is some hope that universal service could be addressed by legislation.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a matter of putting a package together of corresponding interests. And as we said earlier, you know, some parties get something but have to give something up. That's kind of the framework that we use to try to get the 96 Act passed. And I could see a scenario where that could happen in the future as well. You know, universal service funds, the funding mechanism does need to be fixed because it's not sustainable the way it is right now. And that, you know, could lead to some greater contribution from the online services platform companies. And the reason that you think of them is they're getting enormous benefits out of deploying broadband to every consumer. I mean, that expands their market base if everybody has an internet connection. So that's sort of one idea of a compromise. I'm not saying I'm fixated on that, but there are, if we can think of ways to put our priorities together in a way that is a balanced bill, I think that could be successful. I also want to pick up, Gina, you said something off camera, which I thought was so apt after the Benton Institute event, where you said, people can disagree with each other, but that doesn't make you evil, right?
Yeah.
So if we can have a mentality of let's have a debate around the issues and pros and cons, and the ultimate irony here is that usually a bipartisan solution is not just political, but that's often the best policy. Because it's oftentimes when you get extremes from either party trying to go off on a philosophical tangent, that can just make it very difficult or impossible to get things done. And it's also often you need that countervailing force from the other side, from the other party, to try to engage in a more balanced policy result as well as political result.
So I guess I sort of looking backwards, I guess at this point, maybe one of the final question for me to at least to ask all of you is kind of what do you see as sort of being key lessons from the 96 Act effort, the multi-year 1996 Act effort? And what are the good stories that we've missed here, or the good issues, good things that we didn't talk about today? That would be informative to people.
Well, I think maybe the Rolling Stones said it best. You find sometimes you might get what you want. You can't get all of it. You can't always get what you want, but you just might get what you need. If people could approach legislation that way, that you're not going to win everything, you can sometimes get what you need.
Well, I guess I'll just add, I see the structure here that we've talked about a few times of, the balance, the need for cooperation, collaboration from both sides of the aisle. Having said that, we don't have the issues yet around AI really we don't understand AI well enough yet to legislate at a federal level. I think there's a need for some controls and protections going forward, but what those are yet, how you define the problem, is still a bit open-ended. So my thought is that we really need an independent commission, not an FCC commission, but an independent commission to provide us a report to Congress and to policymakers about what the approach should be with regard to AI and the future of universal service. I see those as linked together because we haven't solved the universal service problem yet, but I think AI and the future of technologies and satellite and fixed wireless, as well as fiber, all have a role to play. So I think we need to have some independent report that would clarify the issues, and that would give us a starting point for a bipartisan piece of legislation going forward.
Katie, one thing just popped in my head, and it's because I think it plays into the next panel some, but the 1996 Act set really pretty stringent deadlines for action at the FCC, which Gina, I know you and I both and some of the people on the next panel had to live through, but what was the thought process behind that in Congress? What was the impetus for it in terms of why have them be short? What was going on in the minds of all of you as you were working on those things.
Well, I didn't set the deadlines, John and Katie.
Yeah, you and I had a little bit. Okay.
Although I do think they were a blessing in disguise. You know, you had to get stuff done. You couldn't just debate forever. But what was in your minds?
Well, the Bell companies were pushing for a date certain for them to be allowed into these new lines of business. And they were really pushing as fast as they could and to try to get these provisions over the finish line so they could enter these new markets. They really viewed it as essential to their survival. So we didn't give them a date certain because we thought, well, what if competition doesn't develop? We don't want to deregulate you until there's actual competition on the ground, if you will. So because we didn't give them a fixed date, we expedited the rulemaking proceedings to have the FCC move more quickly. So I think we gave 6 months for local competition, and then universal service had a joint board. So I think that was 18 months or something like that. So I know it was a really hard work by the FCC. It was ridiculous that we gave them such a short time frame. Apologies for that for that, Gina.
It turned out okay.
It turned out okay. You did a great job.
Well, the next panel can take credit. Deserves credit.
So maybe another question that came out. So kind of looking back now, with the benefit of 30 years of hindsight and technology develops and everything else, what in your mind came out differently than you anticipated?
Well, I guess in my mind, we would have had broadband universally available to everybody by now. And we don't have that. You know, we still have 10 to 15% of consumers around the country who don't have access to broadband, and that's a problem. Now it's hard. I'm not saying it's an easy problem, and the BEAD program and the Capital Projects Fund are going to be making progress toward solving that problem. But you know, we see the BEAD program unfortunately being delayed for political agendas that on both sides that have made that program not as successful as I've wanted it to be. So that's frustrating. And ideally, the Universal Service Fund would have provided enough funding, but there hasn't been enough oversight over the recipients of that Universal Service Fund support to make sure that it's actually being spent to accomplish those objectives. So there's been a lot of money spent, not as much oversight as I would have liked to have seen. But I think that's something we are close to solving, and I hope we can solve it in the next 4 years, meaning get everybody access by the year 2030. And so that work still needs to be done.
Katie and Gina, any thoughts on what came out differently?
I think local competition took longer than we might have hoped at the time. It came from places we didn't necessarily anticipate. You know, I don't know how many people under the age of 30 even think of a wireline phone and having one installed. So I think there's local competition developed that way. I think another thing that didn't turn out, or maybe it wasn't as measurable as we would have liked, it is the E-rate. That, you know, literacy rates and math knowledge have dropped dramatically. I don't think it's because of the E-rate. I think it's in spite of, but maybe we had hoped there'd be more measurable benefits.
Katie, any final thoughts? It's interesting what you say, Gina, because GAO was always after the commission, and probably still is, about not having performance measures tied to educational outcomes for the E-rate program. But
Well, but you're asking the FCC, to opine on something that's not their expertise too. So,
which is why they never happened.
right.
I think we've come to time. So I hope everybody will join me in thanking our wonderful panelists who really lived through all the legislative process. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone on the panel for this great conversation about how the 96 Act came to be a reality. And we're now going to turn to our second panel, FCC Implementation of the 96 Act. I'm sorry? Sorry. FCC Implementation of the 96 Act. I would like to welcome our second moderator to introduce the panel, and that is Ruth Milkman. Ruth is another top telecommunications attorney. Most recently, Ruth was a founding partner at Quadra Partners, LLC. Ruth also served as the FCC Chief of Staff from 2013 to 2017 and as Chief of the agency's Wireless Telecommunications Bureau between 2009 and 2013. But at the time of the passage of the 96 Act, Ruth was a senior legal advisor to FCC Chairman Hunt and took on the formidable task of organizing the implementation of the Act. She memorably created a publicly available chart identifying which bureaus were responsible for which rulemakings and the deadlines associated with each. Earlier this morning, Commissioner Gomez referred to that as the Bible. So really important thing. Quick reminder to the audience to submit questions by using the Q&A button at the top or the bottom of your screen. We really want to address everyone's thoughts. So welcome, Ruth.
Thanks so much, Dina. I have a great panel here today, and I'll introduce them in just a minute. I want to also say that I'm actually, Richard Metzger is with me because he had technical difficulties, and so you'll see us switching the camera around. But since we have a long history of working together both at the FCC and at our law firm, I think we'll do fine. So Richard Metzger served as the Deputy Chief of the Common Carrier Bureau during the initial phase of the FCC's implementation of the 96 Act and was responsible for the policy and program planning and competitive pricing divisions. And following his departure from the agency in 1998, he was in private practice in Washington for 25 years and retired at the end of last year. Greg Roston is the Gordon Kane Senior Fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research and also the Director of Stanford's Public Policy Program. In 1996, he was serving as the Deputy Chief Economist of the Federal Communications Commission and the Chief Economist of the Common Carrier Bureau, and most notably had an office next door to Commissioner Gomez, who was before she was a commissioner. During the first year of the FCC's implementation of the 1996 Act, Richard Welch served as chief of the Common Carrier Bureau's Policy Division, and that had responsibility for many of the Commission's rulemaking and adjudicatory proceedings under the statute. He then served 6 months as deputy chief of the Common Carrier Bureau before spending the next 20 years defending the FCC's decisions, including 1996 Act decisions and others before the federal courts. He retired from the FCC in 2021 and now lives in North Carolina. And finally, Chris Wright was Deputy General Counsel of the Commission from 1994 to 1997, and then General Counsel from 1997 to 2001. And in both roles, he was involved in ensuring that the legal analysis of the Commission's orders was sound and in defending the orders on appeal. And he's been a partner at HWG LLP since 2001. All right. First question goes to Richard Metzger. Richard, once this pivotal legislation passed, it was time to get to work. Was the FCC prepared for the challenges it faced in implementing the new statute?
We probably were better prepared than we thought we were at the time. I think the Bureau had, the Common Carrier Bureau, as it was known in those days, had several things that gave it some advantages. Above all, it had a professional staff that had a detailed technical understanding of how the networks operated and what the various functions in the network were. And that was that was essential to devising a scheme to bring competition to the local market. Second, it had an institutional knowledge of managing the transition from a monopoly marketplace to a competitive marketplace, based on their experience in the deregulation of the CPE. CPE is the shorthand for the telephones, the actual devices, and then the long distance market. And then third, I would say Congress, thankfully, at the same time they passed the 1996 Act, they passed a supplemental appropriation for the FCC, and that enabled us to hire a bunch of young, aggressive lawyers and other professionals who brought a lot of energy and enthusiasm, which we really needed to meet the challenges of the deadlines that were established by the Act. So I think all of those were, one more thing let me mention. We also knew going in that at the time, the Chevron doctrine, at least in theory, required the courts to give deference to the FCC in the first instance when the FCC was exercising its technical expertise. And this statute was all about technical expertise. So that gave us confidence, because we knew going in, any significant decision was going to be appealed by somebody. So the margin that the Chevron doctrine gave us some reassurance. And I think all of those factors contributed to the ability of the Bureau staff to develop a comprehensive record and craft quality draft orders for the Commission to review.
Thanks, Richard. Now I'm going to ask Greg to turn to the substance and a more economically oriented question here. There was a transition from analog to digital, and there were silos between industry segments that were breaking down, as was described in the first panel. But the last mile bottleneck persisted. What did you and the Commission do to improve the odds for new entrants and competition?
So first, thanks for having me on the panel. It's good to see Commissioner Gomez again. There were lots of late nights with the team in 1919 M Street. And I want to give, Richard just said about having a great team and people to there. I remember going into the first meetings in Reed Hunt's office with you, Ruth, and Richard, and thinking, oh my God, I had here's my copy of the 1996 Act. Years later, it's not nearly as dog-eared as it was in those first meetings where Richard knew every single section and every single thing and would quote them all to us. That was where the team was prepared. And I thank you guys for doing that. So I just come from auctions, which were sort of the economist's dream, harnessing market forces to push towards efficiency and competition. But we also learned, we knew that we had to have guardrails to prevent anti-competitive behavior. And so in the Act, there were two main pushes for local competition, these silos, that we wanted to get competition in local before we opened up the local companies to get into long distance, these silos. And one was facilities-based competition, and the other was sharing the economies of the local incumbent providers. And the second one was kind of really where a lot of focus went into unbundled elements. Sharing them and pricing them. And there'd been this kind of thing called TS Lyric, total service long run incremental cost, that would split local and long distance services over the shared line. But unis were going to be a thing, a piece of it. And so Joe Farrell and I came up with a new name, total element long run incremental cost. And Joe was pretty proud of getting telephone into that. The TEL part, kind of quaint now that we think of it as a telephone. And while this had solid economics, it was, and it took all the heat and light of it away from the facilities-based side, which was kind of disappointing because the long run, you wanted facilities-based competition. And we made one really critical change in my mind to get facilities-based competition. And that was in the reciprocal compensation for the exchange of traffic. One RBAC economist came in and told me that them paying 1 cent a minute to other networks for sending them traffic, and the other network paying them 3 cents a minute for receiving traffic was reciprocal. So if you remember, this is a small detail, is we changed the reciprocal to symmetric. And so that 1 cent each had to go each way. And the incumbents thought that the world of competition was going to be this nascent cellular service which had very high prices and mostly outgoing calls to networks. So they started with high interconnection fees, and they did not see the new world of internet coming in with ISPs like AOL. And the CLECs that started came in and said, wow, we can get all sorts of traffic coming from the RBAC. And this was competition that pushed the interconnection fees down to cost. It was kind of harnessing competition back again in the same way. So I think that the piece that we really did was trying to harness competition to come back to be the basis rather than regulation, to work with the market as much as possible, even though everybody's attention was directed towards this other piece. This got through and is the kind of the result of now we were able to get wireless and VoIP in much sooner than otherwise would have happened, I think.
Thanks, Greg. Chris, turning to you. You knew that every major decision by the commission would be appealed. What did you and your team do to increase the chances of success? And what's your view on Richard Metzger's take on the importance of Chevron deference?
Thanks, Ruth, and thanks to Commissioner Gomez for giving me a reason to review all the litigation that resulted from the 96 Act. So I'd been at the FCC for 2 years when the 96 Act passed, and the most important thing I'd learned is that the best brief is a good order. I also knew by that time that there were really excellent lawyers around the commission, like the two Richards and Ruth on this panel, and that a lot of them were fully up to speed on what would likely be the most contentious provisions in the Telecom Act, which was a long list. But I knew that despite all of these tough deadlines to meet, we really had a team that was as well prepared as could be to meet them. We had also in OGC analyzed the commission's losses in the courts of appeals in the early 90s. Mac Armstrong led that effort. And it was clear that the commission often failed to, quote, show its work, unquote. And I know that this was something that Richard Metzger and others took to heart, that you couldn't have an order that just said, here's arguments on this side, here's the arguments on that side, we choose X. Even the arbitrary and capricious standard requires more than that. The commission needs to explain why it thinks one party has a better side of the argument. It was also the case at that time that the commission had a reputation as being the waiver commission at the DC Circuit because it passed a lot of inadequately explained waivers, which suggested that the agency had one rule for parties it likes and another for everyone else. So Bill Kennard, as general counsel at the time, and the Bureau leadership organized a series of meetings with commission staff involved in drafting orders in order to try to avoid past mistakes in drafting the many orders that result from the Telecom Act. And as Richard just mentioned, we knew that the Telecom Act was a statute. I think it was 110 pages of the statutes at large. And so there was going to be a lot of statutory analysis. And so it was important for commission staff to understand Chevron deference in detail. And again, the key point which arose out of the other study was to look at these orders had to explain why the commission was choosing one interpretation over another when the text was ambiguous, as it frequently was. I always thought that agencies should not invoke Chevron in their orders. The order should explain why the agency thought its interpretation was the best interpretation, and let the agency's brief add that interpretation was entitled to deference, sort of in the following order. And the brief would say, the commission has chosen the best interpretation, and then at the least it's a permissible interpretation subject to deference. I go on for a while about examples of thinking that I didn't really get a whole lot of deference while I was standing at various panels or in front of various panels across the country defending the orders. But let me make one comment now before the for the benefit of the future. Of course, agencies cannot invoke Chevron anymore. But I think that makes it all the more important for an agency order to explain why it thinks its interpretation of the statute is the best interpretation. In Loper Bright, while overruling Chevron, the court acknowledged that agencies have technical expertise that sometimes warrants deference, and especially when interpreting a new statute, agency may have particular insight into what Congress was doing, as was the case in the 96 Act, and as isn't the case a lot when an agency discovers something new in a 50-year-old statute. But anyway, the lesson for the future, I think, is that courts will pay close attention to what an agency says, although they won't defer unless they're actually persuaded by the agency's explanation after Chevron's been overruled. And remember, appellate counsel cannot offer post hoc rationales for the agency decision in its briefs, although we sometimes do. But the rationale should be in the order to be most effective. So I think should give Richard Welch a chance to weigh in at this point.
Okay, I'm going to ask Richard a question, and then if he wishes to elaborate on what you said, he's welcome to do that. Richard, you're the one person here who was involved both in crafting the commission's policies and then in defending them in court. And as has been noted on multiple occasions today already, the act was ambiguous in places. How did that affect the rulemaking process and then court review?
Well, thank you, Ruth, and thank you to Commissioner Gomez for organizing this event. I'm coming to you from North Carolina, and I can report that people down here are not pausing their daily lives to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Telecom Act down here. And apologies to Greg, but they're not pausing on the street corners in Raleigh to argue the merits of Telric pricing. They're more concerned with college basketball this week. So how did ambiguity affect the implementation and the litigation of the 96 Act? It profoundly affected it. It was huge. And it affected it, I think, in at least 4 ways. First is it injected significant delay into the implementation of the FCC's decisions. Some of these court cases dragged on for years. They went up and down the courts. Sometimes they went even up to the Supreme Court. So there could be years before the FCC's order actually took effect. So significant delay caused by the ambiguity in the statute. The other thing it did is it imposed significant costs. The amount of litigation under the act was just staggering. For the first 4 or 5 years, I tried to track every single appellate decision that came out from every court around the country interpreting a provision of the 96 Act. And I got into the hundreds. I had 3 volumes of it, and I finally just got overwhelmed. I had to give up. And when I think about all the money that got paid to lawyers and economists to litigate those cases, is just enormous. I've often thought some doctoral student in economics should do a dissertation and try to quantify the amount of legal fees and economists' rates that got paid in the litigation. It would be staggering. Another thing the ambiguity did in the statute, a lot of people took the position, and not without some basis, that the ambiguity in the act transferred too much power and discretion to the FCC to implement what it thought should be done rather than implementing the act. And then finally, the ambiguity in the statute gave a few judges, I won't name any names, but I think it gave them the running room to impose their own policy preferences on what the statute should mean. So that ambiguity had a profound impact on all of that. I will never forget, as long as I live, the oral argument in the Supreme Court where the local competition rules were being challenged. And Professor Larry Tribe was there presenting argument on behalf of some of the challengers attacking the FCC's rules. And I can't remember, he used a phrase, he was trying to say that the statute precluded the FCC from taking some of the rules that they put in place. And he used the phrase, Congress spoke with precision in the 96 Act. He used the word precision. And I thought a bolt of lightning went through Justice Scalia's body, and he was going to come over the bench at Larry Tribe. And he said, precision? Precision? You think this statute is precise? And Larry Tribe was kind of taken aback, and he said, well, maybe Congress didn't speak elegantly, but they were precise. And then the opinion comes out, and the memorable last paragraph of the opinion. Remember, the opinion reversed some of the things the FCC, but affirmed some of the things the FCC. And Justice Scalia, speaking for the court, concluded his opinion the following. This is a direct quote. It would be gross understatement to say that the Telecom Act of 1996 is not a model of clarity. It is, in many respects, a model of ambiguity or indeed self-contradiction. That is most unfortunate for a piece of legislation that profoundly affects a crucial segment of the economy worth billions of dollars. He went on from there a little bit. And I'm convinced that that paragraph was a direct response to Larry Tribe saying that Congress spoke with precision in the argument. And the postscript to that opinion was Representative Billy Tozen from Louisiana was one of the leaders in the House to pass the legislation. And he gave an interview to a magazine shortly after Justice Scalia tore into Congress and the ambiguity in the act. And he said this, and this is also a direct quote, it's one of the most honest things I've ever heard a politician say. In response to Justice Scalia's criticism, he said, I've said my mea culpas. We made the act as clear as we could politically. If we wrote a statute everyone understood, no one would like it. I just thought that last part was brilliant. If we wrote a statute everyone understood, no one would like it. So as there was ambiguity throughout in key provisions, and as the prior panel, the legislative panel, was talking about, the act was a huge political compromise. The Bell companies desperately wanted to get, ironically, they wanted to get into the long distance business. They thought that's where all the money and the growth was going to be. And they had, in return, they had to give up their monopoly and open up their networks to their competitors. And so that compromise led to a lot of the ambiguity. I used to do an annual presentation to the lawyers about the appellate case law. And one year I put a slide up on the screen that said, political compromise leads to statutory ambiguity. Statutory ambiguity, in turn, leads to litigation. And litigation, in turn, leads to vacation homes, luxury automobiles, and fully funded college funds for attorneys and economists. And it's true. I also remember at my very first oral argument, which Chris Wright took a big gamble and let me do down at the DC Circuit, threw me to the lions. It was an argument about the proper interpretation of Section 271, long distance entry for the Bell companies. And the Bell companies were taking a, shall we say, a rather aggressive interpretation of Section 271. And the argument's going on, and the judges are getting sort of irritated with the statute, grappling with the statutory language. And finally, I got up to the podium and I was talking, and I thought I was about to make what I thought was a rather profound point. And Judge Silverman cut me off. And he said, "Counsel, who wrote this statute?" And I went, "Excuse me?" He said, "Who wrote this statute?" And all I could think to say was, "It wasn't me, Your Honor. I didn't do it. Maybe some of the attorneys or lobbyists in the gallery wrote it." And then it wasn't my fault, Your Honor. And then it just kind of welled up inside of me and came out. I said, "And after 3 years of grappling with this statute, I feel like I've been ridden hard and put away wet." And he just busted out laughing, and it broke the tension in the room. But that's just another example of the ambiguity in the statute that was pervasive. I guess I can't let it go. Sort of responding to Chris saying he didn't think he always got deference from the courts. There was also the infamous case involving the local competition rules that started in the 8th Circuit in St. Louis. And we got the opinion, and the 8th Circuit just blew us out. And they said a particular provision in the act was a fence that was horse high, hog tight, and bull strong. Now, those who knew me at the FCC knew I used to like to use animal metaphors and canine metaphors to grapple with tough legal issues. And while I thought the 8th Circuit was grievously wrong in the law, I was just in awe of this triple animal metaphor they used. It was a equine, bovine, and swine metaphor all wrapped into one. And of course, Justice Scalia reversed the 8th Circuit, and I think he kind of mocked that metaphor in his opinion. But there wasn't a lot of deference being bandied around out in St. Louis, I can tell you that. I guess I'll stop there and let others pick up from there. But that's how I saw ambiguity affect the implementation and the litigation in the statute.
Thank you. Chris, would you like to respond or elaborate on anything Richard said? You're on mute, though. You're on mute, Chris.
Sorry. I'd be happy to elaborate a little. Part of the problem in defending the statute was political. We in the 8th Circuit, got a panel that basically was primed to believe the attacks from the state commissions and the local bell companies that these orders had been written by a bunch of Washington bureaucrats who wanted to preempt traditional state prerogatives. I have to admit that some of the provisions in the act were quite unclear about who was, whether the FCC was making rules about them or not. But again, we focused on the text. Congress put the 96 Act provisions involving local competition into as amendments to the 34 Act. The Section 201B of the 34 Act gives the FCC rulemaking authority concerning everything in the statute. So Justice Scalia, no friend of Washington bureaucrats generally, saw that, the strongest textual argument was that the FCC had the authority to implement the local competition provisions of the 96 Act, notwithstanding the claim that Section 2B was a horse-high, pig-tight, bull-strong, a barrier to it. And so at least there, we were able to use the text to persuade a court to do the right thing, I think. At least a couple of the opinions that came out might be different now after Loper Bright has overruled Chevron. Notwithstanding what I said a couple minutes ago, the Fifth Circuit panel that heard the challenge to the first universal service order was very skeptical at oral argument about the commission's power to create the E-rate program. And if you'd been at the oral argument, you might have thought it was going to, die in the cradle with a three-judge panel that just sort of didn't like it. And in some fairness to them, if you read the text of sections 254, you don't necessarily see a multi-billion-dollar fund, but you do see that the commission is supposed to, quote, enhance access to advanced telecommunications and information service, unquote, as I think has been noted already here. And so our argument in the brief, again, focusing on the text and at the oral argument was, creation of a large fund to support the wiring of schools and libraries would unquestionably enhance access to advanced services. And here's one where Chevron clearly helped. The court ended the section of its opinion on the E-rate issue by stating that even though the parties challenging the E-rate program had, quote, offered a persuasive reading of the statute, its plain language does not make Congress's intent sufficiently unambiguous for Chevron step one review. And then the next sentence, the only one to say anything good about the FCC's order is, therefore, we defer to the FCC's interpretation under Chevron step two and affirm those aspects of the order providing internet services and internal connections to schools and libraries. So, it's true that Chevron may well have some, will have some real world effect. There is the next time Congress passes an ambiguous statute, which will probably be the next statute it passes.
Thanks, Chris. Earlier panels talked about the deadlines that are, the myriad deadlines that are in the Act. Richard, do you think those were helpful or not helpful? What was the effect?
Well, if you'd asked me in February of 96, I would have said they're definitely not helpful. They're not helpful at all because it gave us 6 months to do a bunch of, and overall, I think it was 180 rulemakings in 18 months, something like that. But I think I agree with what Gina said in the prior panel. I think that, in fact, they were helpful and they worked. But I think one of the reasons they worked is the statute passed with overwhelming majorities on both sides of the aisle in both of the chambers. And to me, that sent an unambiguous message to the FCC that almost everybody on the Hill wanted these reforms done. They wanted them done quickly and efficiently. And I think that gave momentum. It certainly didn't give anybody on any person on the eighth floor some sanctuary to say, oh, no, we're going to block this. We're just going to be obstreperous. That didn't work. So in that sense, once everybody agreed on what the goal was going to be, it just was a matter of putting in the manpower and getting the work done and trying to send them orders that could be defended in court. But I think overall, they worked.
Great.
I remember seeing your chart, Ruth, that of all those things that had to be done in February, of 1996, and thinking, what a task this is. But I guess like everybody else, I think it might have ultimately just been helpful to say, okay, well, we got to write this thing and we can't argue about it forever.
Right. And fortunately, although the Common Carrier Bureau did the lion's share of the work, a lot of the rulemakings were actually done by other bureaus.
Yes. I mean, the centerpiece of the act, at least to me, was the local competition piece, and that's the one that had to get done in 6 months. And that, as I said, if you'd asked me in July, I would have said these rulemakings, these deadlines are completely impossible, but on balance, they worked.
Yeah. So, Greg, part of the FCC's core mission is to ensure that communications services reach and benefit all consumers. How do you think that was reflected in the Act, and how did the FCC think about benefits for consumers?
So I think, I'm glad Chris reminded me that it was section 254, because I wouldn't remember the section number. But prior to the Act, there was this, implicit subsidies that were washing around inside of the incumbent telephone companies, and from high access charges, from high business rates, all sorts of things that were trying to keep things going. And what the Act said was, you need to make subsidies explicit. And so to make subsidies explicit meant, wow, we need to actually see what's going on, and to try to make it, that it's clear how much we're spending. Well, now, as we've seen, the Universal Service Fund has grown quite large. They did some things that I think weren't great by allowing only interstate telecommunications to be taxed, which is a dwindling share of revenues and things like that. But the idea of making subsidies explicit for a specific goal of universal service is exactly the right thing to do. It's now been switched over, included wireless and now broadband, to try to use the same framework to get people online. There are all sorts of various programs. I think the genesis of this was the explicit provision in section 254.
Thanks, Greg. For the next two questions, I'm going to do sort of a lightning round and ask each of you what your answers are. Looking back, what could we have done differently in the implementation phase? What was successful? What wasn't as successful as we thought it would be at the time? Start with you, Richard Welch.
Well, with hindsight, I guess it was probably inevitable, but I think given the short time frames and the intense lobbying, the commission kind of got caught up in what I would call competition fever. And I guess in retrospect, I wished we had not had as robust unbundling rules as we put in place, because that caused such a big fight and gummed things up. Maybe the Supreme Court probably got it right, in my judgment, that we might have gone a little too far with that. The other thing is it is just incredible how technology outraises legislation and regulation, and it's almost impossible to predict how markets and services are going to evolve. I'll give a couple of examples. Think about the internet. The internet was nascent when this statute was passed. Despite the protestations of, I can think at least one person who was a Capitol Hill staffer who insisted that they had spoken directly to the internet and had everything taken care of. The statute only obliquely referred to the internet in passing. And look at how it exploded and within just a few years, it was dominating everything. The other example is, think about the long distance market. That was actually the linchpin of the compromise for the Bells to sign on to the statute, the pathway for them to get in a long distance market. And within a few years, it had evaporated and gone away. It doesn't even exist as a discrete market anymore. But that was what everybody was really worried about back in 1996. So you just can't predict this stuff. It just moves so fast.
Thanks, Richard. Chris?
So I have two answers. One of which is sort of something that I would have changed in the statute if I could, but the points are related. I wish Congress had required the ILECs to show that they can compete in other ILECs outside their territories. If they'd done that, it would have changed the dynamic considerably about things like what unbundled network elements had to be, made available to competitors, because the ILECs would undoubtedly have been required to lease network elements and develop more efficient ways to transfer customers to other companies' switches rather than rather than complaining that competitors weren't doing enough. So that's certainly 2020 hindsight. But along with that, perhaps the FCC should not have let Bell Atlantic acquire NYNEX. At the time, there seemed to be a real possibility that Bell Atlantic could successfully enter the New York City market and demonstrate what a competitor would need to compete with an incumbent. And I think that would have been a very valuable exercise that would have that might have let AT&T and MCI and the long distance companies actually get into local markets rather than get acquired by the box.
Thanks, Chris. Richard?
I don't know. I guess we all wish in some respects the statute had been clearer in some places, and in some places perhaps more ambiguous. I think I agree with Richard that perhaps the most important thing that I would draw on today is that the marketplaces and the communications world we saw in '96 looks nothing like what it is today. And that to me means it's also very hard to take lessons that we learned from the '96 Act and apply them to today's circumstances and hope they'd be effective. And more, perhaps most importantly is, and I think this is something somebody mentioned, I can't remember who, we don't have an agency today that has the same breadth and depth of skill and knowledge about developments like artificial intelligence that the FCC had with respect to communications. And that makes all the difference, because it was that expertise and that experience that I think was the driver behind the commission's ability to implement the statute, ambiguous as it was, within the timeframes in a way that mostly worked, with some exceptions.
Thanks, Richard. Greg?
So I'm going to veer off a little bit from about what, first, I think the role of the states is probably not as well appreciated, because, with the TELRIC standard, they could have done a lot with discount rates and other things like that. And we were not very clear about that, which is fine, because then they gave them flexibility. The piece that I wish they had done, and maybe we should have focused on more, was the competition from wireless. And wireless at the time was the big competition for voice services. And and now the two biggest wireline telephone companies own the wireless companies, or two of the biggest wireless companies. And I think we could have had, throughout the early time, we would have had more pressure from wireless companies. I mean, I don't think they could be any more pervasive than they are now, but prices might be lower if they were separate companies providing services, and now wireless is coming to 5G and providing broadband services, which will also provide competition to both cable and the wireline telcos that provide broadband services. So I wish that had been more pushed in the interim, this structural separation in some sense, pushing the competition.
Right. We have some audience questions. The first one is, what court decisions stand out as being either right on point or quite wrong or surprised you? I guess we'll start with Chris on this one.
Well, let me say that I was quite surprised that the argument that Section 271 was an unconstitutional bill of attainder got any traction at all. I just thought that that was outrageous. The only bills of attainder statutes that had ever been overturned were bills that punished Confederates after the Civil War and communists during the Cold War. And the thought that a statutory provision that gave a group of companies a way that had been monopolists a way to get into competition was somehow in that category was just absurd. And you know, we lost in a district court in Texas, and anyway, we ultimately won in the Fifth Circuit and the DC Circuit. So that was one where justice ultimately was done.
Thanks.
Can I praise Chris right here, Ruth? In that bill of attainder litigation, in an FCC brief, he wrote probably two of the best sentences in a brief I've ever written. It started out something like, this isn't an exact quote, but he said, up to now, the bill of attainder clause of the United States Constitution has been confined to communists and Confederates. Now come the Bell operating companies. I just thought that was fabulous. And nice alliteration, too.
So I just got to work in that in the DC Circuit, Professor Tribe argued on behalf of the box. And he had also testified for the box in front of Congress, saying that they ought to adopt Section 271 as a way to let the box into long distance. And anyway, the key thing about a bill of attainder is that it has to be designed to punish someone. And so I wasn't intending to identify Professor Tribe, but I said I'd like to quote from the box testimony before Congress, two sentences, which basically said, please adopt Section 271 so we get into long distance. And then my point was going to be, it's not punishment when you do something that a party asks for. But anyway, before I got there, Chief Judge Edwards, who was presiding, told me, I don't want to hear those sentences. Don't say them. And another member of the panel, just in case I was thinking of saying them anyway, said, I don't want to hear them either. And so I go on with my argument, and Judge Wald says, after about a minute, I'd like to hear those two sentences you were going to say, Mr. Wright. I look at the other two and say, okay, I'm going to read them. And I did. And anyway, Judge Edwards wrote the opinion, upholding the FCC's position for the unanimous panel. And he block quoted those two sentences in his opinion, but he never thanked me.
Greg, another question from the audience. What are the what do you think led to the death of distance? I assume they mean long distance as a separate market. Wireless competition, de-tariffing, something else?
So this was, I think the very first salvo in this was AT&T's one rate plan that they added in roughly 1998, 97, 98, somewhere in there, they had a one rate plan where all of a sudden you weren't paying difference for a long distance call than a regular call. And that's because they didn't have the same costs. They were able to bundle it all together. And it was, as Richard Welsh was talking about earlier, the technology changed so much faster than the regulation. The cost of providing long distance has dropped dramatically. And so, now there's no difference from calling from, here from where I am to San Francisco to Washington, D.C. or to Mumbai. It's all the same cost. And it's been technology that's changed it.
Richard?
Yeah, I guess I would just add a footnote. I think another change that happened during that late 90s to the early 2000s was interstate access charges were slashed. I mean, at the time of the act, the originating and terminating access charges were probably a nickel to 10 cents a minute, depending on who the carrier was. And there's no way you could sustain a flat rate service with that kind of a per minute charge. Once those rates went way down, then I think driven by the dynamic growth in wireless, and wireless only faced the charges on one end, not just on one. I think that move eventually displaced the long distance companies in providing a single rate, flat rate service. But I think the change in access charges had a big impact.
You're absolutely right. And I think that gets back to something I was talking about earlier, which is the explicit nature of universal service. All of a sudden, the access charges, which were providing universal service, you're absolutely right. They went down, and that allowed these prices to be low.
Great. Well, I think we're at time. So thank you all, panelists, and we look forward to hearing the next panel.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Over to you, Dina.
Apologies, my microphone was up. Thank you to panel 2 for the astute reflections on how the implementation of the 96 Acts unfolded at the FCC. We now turn to our third and final panel, today's challenges. I would like to welcome our last moderator, Commissioner Anna Gomez. And one last reminder to everyone to submit any questions you have by using the Q&A button at the top or bottom of your screen. Welcome, Commissioner Gomez.
Thank you, Dina. So far, this has been such a good day. I really have enjoyed all of the discussions. So our third panel today is to talk about today's challenges. And we have some great speakers lined up for you, starting with Howard Shalansky. Howard Shalansky is a partner at Davis Polk and a professor at Georgetown Law School. He has held several positions in the federal government, including administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, an office that we are involved with today, the director of the Bureau of Economics at the Federal Trade Commission, chief economist at the FCC, and senior economist for the President's Council of Economic Advisors at the White House. Our second panelist is Dr. Robert Pepper, with whom I worked 30 years ago and many years since. Dr. Robert Pepper is a recognized expert on digital technology policy, working at the intersection of connectivity, infrastructure, and emerging technologies, technology adoption, and internet governance. At the FCC, he served as the chief of the Office of Plans and Policy and the chief of policy development for 16 years. Pepper also previously served as acting associate administrator of NTIA, served as head of global connectivity policy and planning at Meta, Cisco's vice president for global technology policy, and helped initiate a program on computers, communications, and information policy at the National Science Foundation. Our next speaker is former Commissioner Robert McDowell. During his time at the FCC, he focused on lowering prices and encouraging innovation through increased competition. And prior to joining the FCC, Commissioner McDowell was a senior vice president for the Competitive Telecommunications Association, or CompTel, and was executive vice president and general counsel of America's Carriers Telecommunications Association. And finally, we are joined by Tom Wheeler, who served as chairman of the FCC from 2013 to 2017. For over 3 decades, Chairman Wheeler has been involved in new telecommunications networks and services, experiencing the revolution in telecom as a policy expert, an advocate, and a businessman. As an entrepreneur, he started or helped start multiple companies offering innovative cable, wireless, and video communication services. He also previously served as president and CEO of NCTA and of CTIA. So I am delighted to have these esteemed speakers today to talk about, so what have we learned and what are today's challenges? And I thought I would start very quickly. We just heard in the last 2 panels about the past, but everyone on the panels has talked about how much has actually changed since in the 30 years since, a lot that we did not actually anticipate. So I would love to hear from each of you talk about the current status of technology from your vantage point. And I thought, because I don't know how long we're going to have Pepper, given that he is somewhere in the Pacific, maybe we start with you while we can, and then we'll go around the table, so to speak.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, you'll have me for the whole time because it's early morning here. It's about 6 a.m. Excuse me for my voice. So in thinking about, and listening, by the way, the previous sessions were terrific, and love the insights and the retrospective look. But back then, what we were focused on was competition, frankly, in the networks, right? And it was getting people connected. It was about the connectivity. And, notwithstanding all of the issues around implementation, competition worked, right? And even just the last question that Greg was addressing with, the death of long distance because of restructuring, the recognition that actually there was something called, both economically, in terms of economics, but theoretically and practically, a termination monopoly. And once you broke the termination monopoly, you had competition, both, locally, long distance, and so on. And that's what we're seeing. But the shift today in terms of the technology, what we're really focusing on, and the big debates today about in technology that are then moving into policy, is that we're focused on what's happening up the stack, right? Yeah, connectivity, the connections are essential. They're the necessary but not sufficient focus of the conversation, right? Today, the big issues are about compute. Where will that compute be? What will happen with that compute? Who's going to control the compute? And that's why we have the not just the debates within the technical community, but also in the policy community and the press about data centers and foundational models and the competition, which is really good among the companies that are developing the new foundational models. And then questions about, once you have these big foundational models, where's the compute? How do you use them? What are the applications? Do you need large models, or do you begin to focus on small models? The evolution of technology that we haven't even begun to have the conversation about, which is what happens when the compute power is put into your device. If it's going to be, my Android phone or my iPhone that is going to have the equivalent of a GPU that's being developed by Qualcomm, what am I going to need the data center for in terms of inference? I mean, there are a whole set of issues. We're at the very, very early stages of this transition, but a lot of it has to do with compute. What is the compute going to be used for? Who's going to be doing the compute? Who's going to control it? Will there be competition? And then what are the guardrails that we need around all of that compute?
Thank you. All right, Howard, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you very much, Commissioner. Pleasure to be here. And, I hesitate to offer any thoughts when I've got Pepper and Tom and Commissioner McDowell on this call. But, I've, been batting these ideas around with all of these folks for a long time. I think I want to build on the point that Pepper just made, which is things are moving up the stack. That's actually been happening for a very long time. If you think back to the very early open access debates that we had about broadband cable, that was really about, letting competing ISPs onto your broadband infrastructure. And gradually things moved up the stack to network neutrality. And what was network neutrality talking about? Not really infrastructure, but moving up into the applications layer. What was going to be what was going to be the ability of a wider variety of applications to get access to to that terminating monopoly or oligopoly. And then things have moved up even further now into the digital platforms that were originally thought of as beneficiaries of network neutrality, now controlling the gateway. And we have Judge Mehta having to decide whether Google controls, vital gateways. Does Apple control vital gateways? These are all the kinds of problems these are all the kinds of issues that are emerging now farther up the stack. Now we get to yet another layer that is running on top of this infrastructure, which are these AI models of various different kinds. And I think there, the big challenge that emerges is how comfortable are we with both the scope and the, I would say, the market structure that seems to be emerging, with these foundation models. And to what extent do we want to avoid what many would say are the mistakes of the past of letting these platforms that emerge, whether it's 2 or 3 or 4 of them, also be able to have a lot of vertically integrated complementary kinds of products that effectively foreclose innovation or access by competitors at yet that higher level that's running on top of those foundation models. So what can we learn from the past about how to address these challenges? There's a lot being written now about principles of neutrality, principles of interoperability, principles of openness that are higher up in the stack. Should we require, for example, all of these foundation models to interoperate with all kinds of more specific complementary applications that might run on top of them? If so, what are the terms of access? How do we define and how do we price, if we price at all, that interoperability? And I think from there are some very interesting lessons that we can look back on, in the telecom world. I mean, certain things like number portability are a form of, if you will, interconnection, interoperability that, worked extraordinarily well and opened up a widely competing, realm of basic telecommunications. Is there something like that we need to do or can do on the data front to enable different kinds of collaboration tools and sharing tools that might run on top of these kinds of platforms? If we look back on, just sort of basic interconnection from the 1996 Act, there were lots of, challenges and problems and difficulties about the level of interconnection and access that had to be provided, how that was priced, all the tower pricing debates. But at the same time, I think we may have learned some lessons about areas where interoperability mandates worked and interconnection could work. So to what extent can we draw on those past lessons from in the 30 years that have occurred since to help us think about these new technologies? I think there are tough challenges, and I'll defer in a moment to the rest of the panel to maybe talk about some of those in reaching those definitions. But I do think that is going to be that whole history of interoperability, of openness, is going to be one of the things that we think a lot about. And just to make one shameless plug, you're probably all familiar with the Digital Crossroads first and second editions that John Nectarline and Phil Weiser wrote. Each of those having to do a massive update because of incredible transformations that occurred like over a decade. The last version of that book was 2014. The new edition is coming out. Phil's got a day job, so I have joined and co-written that third edition with John. It's coming out on MIT Press this year, but it talks a lot about what has changed and what the lessons are that we might draw for these new technologies, particularly in the last chapter. And if time permits, I'll talk more about those.
Thank you. That was a great summary. Now we're talking a lot about really computing, or compute, as Dr. Pepper put it, and AI. Are there other markets that maybe we haven't had legislation or that have current challenges that we should be talking about? Rob, I thought maybe you could address that.
Thank you, Commissioner, and I'm humbled to be among such an august group. Happy St. Patrick's Day, especially to Carol Wheeler, who's been very involved with the Irish Embassy, and I've been her guest there a few times in the Washington, Ireland program. Wore my green tie, shamrock cufflinks. And I refer to Pepper as Dr. Pepper because we had a duck named Pepper once, and he met a fox, and it didn't end well for Pepper. So I will call Robert Pepper Dr. Pepper. So I have a space background, in part because the last Teams call I was on was a space tech call, one of the fastest growing areas, as the Commissioner knows, of sort of FCC land, if you will. Being a radio frequency chauvinist of sorts, I will tell my colleagues here at Cooley, a very large law firm, and by the way, I'm not speaking on behalf of any client, because probably some things I'll say could annoy them, hopefully not anger them to the point of firing me, but we'll find out. But that you can't do anything in space without radio frequency energy. You can't launch the thing, you can't steer the thing, you can't talk to the people on the thing if there are people there, you can't bring it back, you can't operate your robots on the moon to mine it or whatever it is you want to do without radio frequency energy. And that's regulated not just by the United States of America, but by other nation states and by international treaty, which I know Commissioner Gomez knows a ton about. But the U.S. so far is sort of leading commercial space, entrepreneurial space. This is something that was not contemplated by the 96 Act. And by the way, first of all, thank you, Commissioner, for putting together this event. I work with so many people who weren't even out of diapers when the 96 Act was signed. So it's good to remind them how seminal and huge it was, hard to do by Congress, phenomenally bipartisan in nature, right? And had such a profound impact. And while it was not perfect by any means and litigated for years, there was a lot of good. And I know your previous panels have talked about that. But what was not contemplated was commercial space or entrepreneurial space. So this is a multi-trillion-dollar segment of the world's economy. We're in a boom right now. There'll probably be an adjustment. We might call it a bust later. But right now, there's a lot of investment capital with some fascinating ideas. But if you are a entrepreneur in this space, I have to say that at least once, you have to talk to the FCC, Department of Commerce. So that's NTIA at the Department of Commerce, but also Office of Space Commerce, and NOAA and other offices in the Department of Commerce, NASA, FAA. If you want to launch your thing, you have to get their permission. If you want to bring the thing back to Earth, you have to get their permission again. Other folks at DOD, of course, NASA, DOT as well, other folks, and many others. And then that's just in our country, right? And other countries like Germany or maybe Australia are trying really hard to make it easier for entrepreneurs to come there and kind of flag their space businesses in their countries, right? So that's something that needs to be looked at. It'd be great, ideally, if there could be some sort of one-stop shopping, or at least 1 or 2 or 3-stop shopping, if you're a commercial space company with shot clocks and other things. And also that kind of segues into spectrum, which is, it's becoming harder to find spectrum to bring to commercial markets. Government users of spectrum, like the spectrum that they had, are reluctant to give it up anymore, to be kind. And then there's the government versus private sector, then there's terrestrial spectrum versus space spectrum, and there's kind of less and less being allocated for space. Although we saw, I think, about 58% more launches of space stations, as we call the vehicles in space, last year than any other year, the previous year, and there'll be more and more over time. There's talk of data centers in space, maybe 1 million satellites. We'll see if that actually happens. That's going to be very expensive in the trillions of dollars, but nonetheless, a lot of spectrum is going to be required if we want to do things in space. And there are many wonderful applications of space, making pharmaceutical products in near zero gravity, for instance. can be done much more efficiently. Proteins and molecules form differently in near zero gravity, and in 4 milk jugs, you can provide a vaccine that could inoculate every person on the entire planet, for instance. So a lot of wonderful things that can help humanity and the planet going there, but I think we're going to need Congress to step in and figure out exactly what our space public policy is going to look like, and related to that, spectrum as well. If Marty Cooper were whispering in my ear, the inventor of the cell phone, he'd be saying the spectrum shortage is okay because it'll force everyone to become more spectrally efficient. So I have to say that in honor of my 97-year-old friend, Marty Cooper. But nonetheless, every device you can think of is gobbling up more and more spectrum, and it's causing friction, right? A public policy headwinds. So kind of in a coconut shell there, those are some issues that maybe the 96 Act needs to be reopened so we can solve those problems too. And hopefully in the same bipartisan spirit the 96 Act was born into.
Thank you for that coconut shell. So Chairman Wheeler, you come to this with some perspectives that you have been talking about with regard to particularly artificial intelligence. Obviously, I'd like you to talk about anything you want to talk about, but I was hoping you might tell us some of what you have been putting out there in terms of what needs to be done to ensure, to ensure that the market remains competitive and innovative and that consumers benefit and so on and so forth.
Oh, that's all. Well, first of all, Commissioner, what a great idea to do this today. Thank you for doing that. I've been here since noon. It's been a trip down memory lane. I mean, wow. And the other part about it is that all of the folks who preceded the panels, the service that they gave, the intelligence and the dedication that they brought to their tasks. You included former staffer Gomez, were incredible. I said to Reed Hunt one time that I thought his greatest contribution as chairman was the quality of the people that he brought to the commission and changed the intellectual fervor of the commission, and so much of telecommunications afterwards. So, I mean, it was been wonderful listening to all these folks. Now, I've been filibustering after listening to my colleagues here, because it's awfully hard to follow that kind of wisdom. But let me pick up once again in the leadership that Pepper has shown in getting us all to talk about things in his terms. And that is the question of the stack and how everything is moving up the stack. 96 does not exist anymore. Maybe you noticed that. In 96, the internet was AOL. Media policy was cable and broadcast competition. Contention, better than competition. Telephone, as we've heard, was all about post-breakup and long distance. Spectrum decisions were made on the basis of analog physics, not digital physics. Everything we talked about was narrowband, not broadband. To go back to Pepper's line about the stack, that's the lower part of the stack. And they're all important kind of things, but the question is, what are they doing to facilitate the top of the stack, which are applications that affect people, affect productivity for the economy, and define what the future is. And unfortunately, we don't have a structure, because it is based on 1996 realities, that equips us to deal with that. We need to have, as Howard said, a competitive environment. We're in the process right now. 2/3 of all the cloud compute capacity in the world is controlled by three companies right now. You cannot build AI unless you have access to compute power. It's a bottleneck. The models are bottlenecks. Even quasi-open or open weight models are bottlenecks because middleware has been put in between them and the frontier models themselves. So you have to ask yourself, in that kind of an environment, is there a relevance for the FCC? Or the FCC, an agency created to deal with the lower part of the stack, created under structures that were based on analog assumptions. Is that agency capable of dealing with the application of the lower sectors of the stack to the new digital AI-based applications that are in the process right now of changing our world? And that problem becomes even worse post Loper-Bright and major questions doctrine. Because if anything, what we need right now in technology is agility. And if anything, statutes aren't. And I loved, I think it was Gina Keeney's comment early on where I think she was quoting Billy Tozan as saying that people understood the bill, they wouldn't pass it because you can't make the tough decisions and get people to vote for it. So our challenge going forward is, will our policymakers in a frame larger than the FCC at the White House and in the Congress have the vision to say, hey, the world has changed. We can't keep relying on the assumptions and the structures and the statutes that we put in place 30 years ago. We've got to do something today. And as we heard in the previous panels, the key to that happening before was a bipartisan coming together around a common sense, set of ideas that were trade-offs with each other, as we heard quite explicitly. And are we capable of even doing that today?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Loper-Bright and the major questions doctrine, because one of the things that I think a lot about is with regard to the 96 Act, there's so much about the market that evolved that we had no idea was coming. And I one of the things I think about is, to the extent we are advising Congress to pass legislation to address today's challenges, whether it be in space or whether it be artificial intelligence or up the stack, as you guys call it, how do we address these issues without freezing in time the state of technology? In the end, listening to all of you speak, I hear kind of echoes of the issues that Congress was trying to address back in '96. What are the bottlenecks? How do we introduce competition to them? You know, what's the number portability in our future or current or galloping into the future right now? So I don't know if you have thoughts on any and all of that, and I don't have any specific person I wanted to tag with this. So maybe start with Howard, since he's got some deep thinking on generally the state of technology and regulation.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there are two separate questions. I mean, one is, what can the FCC do? And the second is, you know, what might Chairman Wheeler's, you know, theoretical new agency do if we were to have sort of an, you know, an agency that was really purpose built for addressing some of these concerns? What would a new statute, what would a new sort of administrative system look like? I do think that the FTC's lever on a lot of these issues is after Loper Bright and after West Virginia against EPA, fairly limited. You know, if there was a tenuous grasp on being able to get network neutrality, I think being able to designate things farther up the stack as being within scope of the statutory authority of the agency seems a much bigger risk. And, you know, Congress has hardly given guidance about what it thinks should be done in these emerging areas of technology. And when you consider the extraordinary impact on everyday life, the extraordinary amount of money, and sort of the dependency upstream on two major inputs, power and compute, you know, it really becomes something that probably does need, you know, as Commissioner McDowell, as Tom Wheeler said, a new statute and a new way of thinking. So what should that new statute do? And here I think there's a real reason to hit pause and to think about what technology are we talking about? When we're talking about, you know, say the big foundation models, well, right now there's a really intense competitive horse race going on amongst 3, possibly 4 providers of such models that are US based. Well, 3 that are US based, 1 that's France based, and probably a handful, but certainly 3 or so that are China based. And, you know, let's put aside the Chinese model developers, let's put aside Mistral in France, and let's just think about Google and, you know, and Anthropic and OpenAI here. That's a very different kind of competitive horse race than the kind that we were talking about, for example, even in the emergence of wireless that depended on government allocations of spectrum and things like that. And so the question is, what kind of regulation is needed to ensure that that competition doesn't get arbitrarily cut off and that those foundation models can continue to compete? And for example, Google, just to pick an example, can't use certain kinds of incumbency to drive use of its models, that Microsoft can't, you know, use it, you know, its incumbency and its, you know, sort of presence and collaboration tools to drive, you know, its models or its services, and, you know, various kinds of concerns like that. I think that there is a set of principles, both from antitrust law and from telecom law, that could be drawn on. But right now, those are all being done, I would say, through ex post competition enforcement, antitrust enforcement. And you've got the antitrust agencies looking at those issues, but without a purpose-built statute for thinking about kinds of duties to deal, kinds of interoperability, kinds of interconnection that are, I would say, on tenuous doctrinal ground in antitrust law and without statutory development. So, you know, should that be where where the regulatory, you know, issues sort of focus? And then what I said before about making sure that that ecosystem stays vibrant. You know, do people who use a particular foundation model have the ability to use lots of different complementary products, to access their own data across different platforms? I think these are going to be sort of the questions of the day. And I don't see right now whether it is in, you know, you could try to stretch antitrust law to get there. I think it'd be very hard to stretch telecommunications law and the regulatory authority of the FCC to get there. So we probably are going to need at a certain point after this market shakes out a little bit to have some hard thinking at the policy level. And that's going to, I think, have to be legislative.
Can I pile on that for a second? Because I think Howard raises some really good points. I mean, I would have one difference that you talk about the horse race, Howard. Yeah, there are 3 folks who appear to be in a horse race. I'm worried about other people getting on the track. All right. And the three folks that you name dominate the American tech stack. I mean, let's just look at the tech stack for a second, in basic terms. We got chips at the bottom. You got processing built on top of that. And then you got models built on top of that, all of them working up to deliver applications. And what we want is this horse race in applications. But the trouble is that the folks who are on the track down here below control these steps to get into the ability to have an applications horse race. And I agree that antitrust law, as important as it is, as much as it needs to continue to be pursued, that it is ex post, it is far too slow. By the time that the Google decision finally gets, the search decision finally gets out of the court, it's going to be irrelevant. And so how do we deal with that again in an agile way? And it seems to me that yes, as you've referenced, we need some kind of a new structure, but more important than that, we need a new way of thinking, that we can't bring the kind of regulatory micromanagement to this dynamic marketplace the way we have seen in the history of the FCC and other agencies. That what we need to be doing is saying, okay, here are the expectations. This is how we expect you to behave. You go and determine the route to get there. But I'm telling you, this is wrong, and this. We're not going to tell you how to run your company, but we are going to tell you that the society has a right to establish expectations and hold you accountable for them.
So let me jump in for a second and agree, but then disagree a little bit. So I do think that what Tom said about, not focusing on micromanagement, but setting out sort of functional, what do we want to achieve and what do we want to avoid? And you figure out how to make that happen, right? I think that makes a lot of sense. But we also need to separate what are the issues that we're concerned about in that context. I do not at this point agree that we have bottlenecks among the models. I haven't seen that. And what we don't want to do is prematurely have sort of ex ante requirements. And Commissioner, you alluded to this, that create lock-in for the today's large models. And you want to be able to, and that's the problem, right? It's very different to have number portability for telecom coming out of an analog world. Right. It was, narrow. It doesn't require sort of an interoperability of a model that has billions of or hundreds of millions of lines of code. What does that mean at this point? I mean, people I work with are developing applications, downstream applications for, whether it's in the pharmaceutical area, building on, identifying, new molecules, or transportation, or in emerging markets, food security. These are smaller models that they are developing using some of the large foundational models, and they're drawing on all of them. And what they're doing is they're having Claude, check something that they've developed on ChatGPT. And so the downstream, people on the downstream application development are using multiple models to improve and to check what other models are doing. So we have not yet seen, right, a bottleneck that does not allow for that kind of work. And I think we do have to be concerned if we see that, but it's not yet happened.
Bob, I think you're missing, I will shut up here in a second, but I think you're missing the business perspective here. which is that for model builders, the big three that Howard talked about, for model builders, their problem is they have an incredibly expensive asset that they can barely pay off out of their earnings thus far and are being forced to go to the application layer. It's the only smart business thing to do, is to continue to move up the stack. When they become the players where they are competing with their competitors, if you will, because they control the lower levels of the stack, that is an issue that we need to be worried about prospectively, not, oh my God, look at this mess.
No,
How do
and
we
Tom,
cut the baby in half here?
No, I agree. You're talking again, very analogous to what we were dealing with in '96. Is there an essential input that a new entrant needs, right, from somebody who is
right
providing not just that essential input, but also competing at the it's not the application layer, but competing in the product that I'm trying to build. So I agree with that, but I think what we have to be careful about is prematurely thinking we know how they're going to do that, or even if they're going to be successful. And what we need to have ways to monitor that to see if, in fact, problems evolve, and then how to address them. We can't be blind to it. I completely agree.
We heard that the Telecom Act was a 6-year process. Okay, there was nothing premature there. Okay, we need to start having this discussion now, and we're not having it. Other than God bless Anna Gomez for getting us in this environment to have this kind of debate. But have we had this discussion before the Congress? I remember that there must have been 50 hearings on the Telecom Act by the time it finally passed. And they were educational hearings. They weren't performative hearings. They were, how do we learn? I'm done. I'll shut up.
So I know we're going to pivot here to Q&A here in a few minutes. So a lot has been said, but not everyone has said it yet. So real quick, let me comment on a couple things as we segue maybe into Q&A, which is, first of all, a clarification. I think Loper Bright gets misunderstood. I'm old enough to where when I went to law school, Chevron was a relatively new case. It was 1984. I entered law school in 87. So it hadn't been Chevron yet. It wasn't. It was one of many cases you studied in administrative law. And the end of Chevron doesn't mean the end of agency expertise. It means that courts won't defer to an agency interpretation of its own statute when that statute is ambiguous, right? So I want to give some hope there, right? So I remember when Loper Bright was handed down, I saw friends on the sort of libertarian right pop champagne corks and folks on the left start crying and throwing themselves out of windows. And I said, you're both wrong. Knock it off. Sally forth. You'll see an agency's opinion is still given weight, is just not given deference. So that's important to understand. And then there are some building blocks. Look, it's going to take a long time for Congress to rewrite any of these laws. They'll probably be more surgical or narrow than anything. It can't even pass a comprehensive nationwide privacy bill, right? And that's been going on for 20 years. But if you look at, I'm going to take Spectrum as one example, which is flexible use policies. I think they started being introduced in the first Bush term or thereabouts under Michael Powell. But that has allowed for more efficient use of spectrum, one could argue. Others have gamed it, no question, to warehouse and be spectrum flippers, and that's a problem. And the commission, however, does have, the FCC, the best agency, does have the tools, the legal tools to enforce against spectrum warehousing or inefficient use such as that. But flexible use led to an explosion. So I was at the commission starting in 2006, and 3G was still the standard, and we were trying to plan on the spectrum auctions that would take us to 4G. And I think that was a quantum leap once we got there, but we weren't micromanaging 4G. The iPhone debuted in my second year on the commission in 2007. Nobody really saw that coming except for the wonderful engineers at Apple, right? And didn't know that they needed it, but it was born in a 3G world. And unless you're on Wi-Fi, it wasn't much good. So once we got 4G more ubiquitously built out, then smartphones became a thing. Then that led to an explosion in the application layer that's been the topic of conversation here, right? So that has been, we're talking on an application right now, and yes, it's owned by a very large company, but there are millions of apps out there, many created by folks in their houses, on their own, not by large corporations. And that has contributed tremendously to the world economy and improved the human condition overall. And there are some that aren't so good either and have done bad things as well, but net a big positive. So I think we need to keep that in mind as we go forward. And there's the debate between ex ante or common carrier style regulation. The term net neutrality was born in 2004 by Tim Wu. That everyone knows my position on that. I don't think it was needed. I still don't. I think competition law takes care of the parade of horribles that was always marched out to say we needed them. But nonetheless, competition law is important and enforcement of it is important. I think those are two things we can glean from what some of the speakers have said, and you need to watch. But it's been such a wonderful, the whole TMT, telecom, media, tech marketplace, a dynamic, fast-moving marketplace. It's been absolutely amazing to watch. When I was sworn in on June the 1st, 2006, the largest social media platform was MySpace. Twitter was in its infancy. Facebook was still in its infancy. And that changed rather rapidly. So why is that? Because incumbents can be disrupted. And yes, you need competition antitrust law to make sure that incumbents aren't abusing their incumbency or their market position. And I think you're going to have to rely on that, realistically speaking, to make sure you have competition going forward, because it can be very difficult for Congress to legislate anything specific in the meantime. And I know now we're probably up on Q&A time, so I want to defer back to the commissioner who actually has statutory and constitutional power, not like us has-beens, Tom.
That's right.
Sure. Well, I did want to ask one more question of my own. I like to think about these issues in human terms. So when we talk about regulating today, we talk about making sure that everyone in the United States can get access to telecommunications or to communication services, for example. We worry about consumer protection. We want to make sure that people with disabilities can access all of these technologies and more. And so I'm curious what you would say would be the first line of the act about the purpose of any future legislation on these services. The Communications Act says that, it's for the purpose of regulating communication by wire. I'm going to paraphrase because it's really long. So as to make available, so far as possible, to all people of the United States without discrimination, a rapid, efficient, nationwide, and worldwide and radio communication service for the purpose of promoting safety and life and property through the use of wire and radio communications, and so on and so on. What should be the words in any future legislation that enable whoever does this? And I've heard a lot of people say it shouldn't be the FCC. Maybe, and Rob, you said there's too many people involved in space, at least as far as I heard it.
Too many agencies, yeah.
Too many agencies. But if Congress legislates, what should be the primary goals, and who are the beneficiaries in the end of those primary goals?
I'll be real quick with an answer and let others follow, which is I think the first three words should be do no harm. I could also go on to say don't screw up, but do no harm and go from there. But go ahead. I want to hear what the others have to say.
I'm sure the courts will take that. Absolutely. Howard, I don't know if you had something, or I saw you lean forward.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's, I think a lot of groundwork has to be done before we know about the need for legislation, as Commissioner McDowell just said. And I do think that when we're even taking Tom Wheeler's point very much to heart, I think there's a question about, we don't know how people are going to go up the stack, or even whether that's a bad thing to have, various integrated alternatives. But I think what I would say is that if we're going to have a statute, it should say to preserve a marketplace most conducive to innovation and competition. But I would probably focus on innovation, say to preserve incentives and the ability to succeed through innovation.
So I would agree with Howard in terms of we're starting with that specifically. But one of the lessons of the last several years is one of the things I was doing was working with the Economist Intelligence Unit. We had a 6-year time series study that we were working on called the Inclusive Internet Index, and took a look at about 100 countries globally, looking at about 54, 55 indicators for each country. And as part of that research, the Economist Intelligence Unit came, and we called it the Inclusive Internet Index. They came up with that term, the Inclusive Internet Index. And the reason they did that was it was not just about being connected to the internet, it was being able to use and benefit from being connected to the internet. And so when we think about, with the Telecom Act, when we looked at the digital divide, it was who's not connected. There's affordability on the connections, is, the network available, et cetera. That was about being connected. But for everybody to benefit, there are other aspects, right? So it's not just being connected to use it, but there's a whole set of skills. And some of the big issues that we're, looking at with AI is job replacement, or having to reskill, and how is it going to have an impact, both positive and potentially negative, on people's lives. And I think that as a society, we need to think about how does everybody benefit from these developments. But I would start where Howard started, because it is about innovation, but we also need to build in from the beginning, all right, a focus on universal benefit from the technology development.
I think you're spot on, Bob. The term public interest, convenience, and necessity in the 34 Act is an abomination in terms of instructions. It has created the environment that we're now seeing, where the FCC is intimidating people in their free speech rights by saying, hey, it's not the public interest. I agree with Chairman Carr when he proposed that we need to have a rulemaking defining what the public interest will be. That would be an interesting exercise and a debate worth having.
I almost fell out of my chair there for a second. Sorry, go ahead.
But to Howard's, do I agree with that part? Well, I think
I was waiting for the rest of the sentence.
But I think to Howard's, but with Howard and Bob's point is that we're going to have to be specific in expectations. Where's the expectation of privacy in this discussion? Where's the expectation that there are going to be effects? How we have never sat down and said, here are the kind of effects we would like. Public interest, convenience, and necessity, just and reasonable. No, we need down to get to a situation saying, well, what do we want this to look like? And those are, I can't answer that right now, but those are tough questions that need to be debated, and we need to have specificity in a general instruction that has to then be interpreted.
Yeah, I think that's right. One thing that John Windhausen said was, you know what, he doesn't think we know enough yet about where this is all going and to create a whole regulatory agency. but instead Congress should create a commission. Wait, was it a commission to study, to issue a report?
Yeah.
Basically making recommendations.
Well, it's a better suggestion than what we've seen in the executive orders, for instance, that say that where the president instructs Brendan Carr to have a rulemaking that will start determining what states are allowed to do with regard to AI. That's an instruction to your agency right now that we're not talking about, but we sure need to be talking about.
Yeah, as you've mentioned, our authority is questionable under the existing statute on some of these issues. I do have to say there's sort of on the edges, we probably have some authority simply because of our regulation over the carriers themselves, the spectrum, things like that, robocalls. I did want to ask one more question. One thing that we learned and that I really heard from the first panel was that the reason Congress was able to get legislation through was that every party wanted something and every party was willing to give something up. So it's all about incentives. Does this exist, A, in the space arena, and I think that's pretty easy, and B, in this new artificial intelligence marketplace that is just very rapidly developing?
I'll comment briefly on space and then I'll let others answer the rest, which is, yeah, there's a lot of common interest, a lot of common thinking about what entrepreneurial space companies need. And so I think you'll see a lot of agreement there. There will be disagreement at federal agencies about their jurisdiction, however, right? Plus all those agencies I mentioned at the outset, those are different congressional committees with different jurisdiction. So Armed Services Committee, Commerce Committee, Science Committee, transportation committees. And so to get different committee chairs to agree on something a la the 96 Act is going to be really hard. The 96 Act was primarily a Commerce Committee Act, which actually one could argue started right after the MFJ, the breakup of AT&T modified final judgment in 1984, all the way through 96. So that took maybe 12 years. I heard, 4 or 6 years earlier, and maybe that's being kind and generous. I think it took even longer than that. So I think, however, entrepreneurial space can agree in a lot. And maybe there could be a skinnier piece of legislation regarding all that. As far as all the other industries in sort of communications world, FCC land, I'll let others answer that question.
Howard, I know you need to leave. I don't know if there was something you wanted to add, or I can just say thank you.
I can stay for 5 more minutes.
Okay.
But all I'll say is I do think that I can't speak to the space context, but I think in the AI context, you do have you might have a large community of folks that have differing interests, but might all have something to gain and to trade off in legislation. Again, I don't think we're there yet because I think we don't know what those trade-offs are. And I think that we don't know, even if the participants themselves know how the market's going to shake out. So I think, I'll just conclude my remarks quoting, the great Chairman Bill Kennard, who, when urged to regulate early broadband, said, we don't have a monopoly. We don't have a duopoly. We have a noopoly. Well, it's a little bit of a different situation when we look at the AI sort of universe. We do have a race that is emerging, and some might try prematurely, I think, to call it just a triopoly or something like that. I think there's a lot of competitive ferment still. And I think we just don't know what kind of market we are looking at. But one thing just to be very mindful of, it's a lot easier to be successful when you're regulating a clear monopoly. Your regulation's more likely to do good than harm than if you're regulating a competitive space. The more competitive a market is, the less margin there is for your regulation to improve over what the market will generate. And I think we should be very mindful of that as we think about any regulation going forward and make sure make sure there's a need for it, but not to wait too long that need can no longer be served.
Thank you. All right, so we're basically out of time. I don't know if there's anything quick that Pepper or Tom want to add.
Well, if we're going to do AI, yeah, of course, Tom has something to say. If we're going to be talking about AI, the challenge with AI is that we can't grapple with AI, the huge AI.
Yeah.
You can't get your arms, you got to break it down into its parts, okay? What are the effects of AI? You know, we bias, discrimination, fraud, those kinds of things. What is the situation that creates the environment that delivers those effects, i.e., back to the conversation we've been having all along about competition. So we need to parse the issues. Otherwise, we are going to be in a mosh pit that we'll never be able to get out of because the goal is too broad and generic.
All right, well, we started with a quote from the Rolling Stones and we ended in a mosh pit. So I think that's a perfect way to end this panel. Thank you so much for giving your expertise. It's really been a terrific conversation. I could have gone on much longer. So please help me thank our talented panelists for this spirited conversation about the lessons of the 96 Act and how we can apply them to today's communications and technology challenges. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank Chairman Carr for opening this event. Despite our differences, we continue to find ways to work together on the issues that matter most for this country, and I deeply appreciate his friendship and his participation today. So our first panel took us back to the legislative origins of the Act, and what struck me most about that was the reminder of just how much bipartisan collaboration it took to get there. Those vote margins, 91-5 in the Senate and 414-16 in the House, did not happen by accident. They were the result of hard negotiating, real give and take among the companies, the bell companies, the cable operators, the broadcasters, and rural advocates, all working toward a shared goal. Our panelists reminded us that universal service protections, including E-rate, were hard-won victories that required champions on both sides of the aisle. It was a masterclass in finding common ground and a good reminder that a big, complicated legislative package is a very hard and very human endeavor. Our second panel brought us inside the implementation, and what came through clearly was just how much the FCC's professional staff and institutional knowledge made that possible. The work was immense and it moved fast. I will say, Ruth's implementation chart was so essential that I may have called it the Bible at some point, and I stand by that. Our panelists reflected on the importance of writing clear, well-reasoned orders, not just citing authority, but actually showing your work, because the courts were watching and ambiguity was costly. But the bipartisan momentum behind the Act gave the FCC the confidence to move swiftly, and on the whole, the Commission rose to the occasion. And I have to give a special shout out to Richard Metzger, whose efforts to join us today were just short of heroic. Richard, we are so glad you made it. Our third panel brought us squarely into the present, and the question at the center of it was a familiar one. Is our regulatory framework keeping pace with technology? The honest answer is that it is not, and our panelists did not shy away from saying so. The concentration of AI infrastructure in just a handful of companies raises the same competition concerns we think raise the same competition concerns that we faced with local telephone monopolies 30 years ago. But the lessons of the 96 Act are exactly what is needed now. Build in flexibility, write clearly, act with urgency, and do it together in a bipartisan way. The work is not finished, it's really just beginning. 30 years ago, we were in the thick of it, racing to meet deadlines, figuring things out in real time, and trying to get it right for the American public. What I remember most, though, is not the chaos, it's the people. People who cared deeply, argued hard, and ultimately found a way to work together towards something bigger than any one of us. Today's conversations reminded me exactly of that spirit, the willingness to engage seriously, to disagree generously, and to keep consumers front and center. That's what made the 96 Act work. And it's what gives me hope for what comes next. So thank you again to our panelists and to everyone who joined us today. I hope you leave this conversation as inspired as I am. Until next time.
And with Commissioner Gomez's remarks, we have come to the end of our program. Thank you for joining us today to reflect on the lessons from this historic piece of legislation. And we hope you can join us in person this Thursday for a reception to commemorate the 96 Act beginning at 1 p.m. at the FCC headquarters. The reception is open to the public, and have a great rest of your afternoon.